Good evening. I'm Rick Peters, President of the Boston Medical Library. Welcome to the 47th Annual Garland Lecture. The Boston Medical Library was founded in 1875 to serve the library needs of practicing physicians and dentists in the Commonwealth. As many of you know, the Boston Medical Library is in transition. We have a new contract to provide library services through UMass Chan Medical School, Lamar Suter Library. Interlibrary loan service is available, and the delivery of requested articles and chapters has been very efficient. In addition, the library will mail you a book if you want to borrow one, and will include a postpaid return envelope for ease of return. This service is available to BML fellows and to Massachusetts Medical Society members. Please see our website, bml.org, and please consider becoming a fellow of the Boston Medical Library. This lecture will also be posted at bml.org within the week. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. The Garland Lecture is named in memory of Dr. Joseph Garland, the 13th president of the BML, and a former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. The Garland Lecture has been one of the proud traditions of the BML since 1976. The lecture tonight is Climate Change, Pollution, and Health. What can healthcare professionals do? We hear often about the dangers of climate change and pollution, yet the relevance of these global threats to medical practice is not well understood. This lecture will review the current evidence, quantify the magnitude of the threat, and suggest solutions that may be meaningful to physicians. Next slide, please. Our speaker for tonight's program will be introduced by Dr. Alfred D. Maria. He will also moderate the question and answer section of the program, which follows the lecture. Please type your questions into the question and answer tab, not the chat tab. Dr. D. Maria is a trustee of the BML, a member of the Garland Committee, and a distinguished public health physician and director of the Public Health Museum in Tewksbury. He retired as medical director of the Bureau of Infectious Disease in the Massachusetts Department of Public Health and state epidemiologist for Massachusetts. Next slide, please. Al?
Thank you, Dr. Peters, and it's my privilege and honor to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Philip Landrigan, who a pediatrician and epidemiologist and a public health legend in the particularly in the field of occupational and environmental health, child health, and passionate evidence-based advocacy. Dr. Landrigan is a professor of biology at Boston College and the founding director of the program on global public health and the common good and the Global Observatory on Pollution and Health. He is a Boston native, distinguished alumnus of Boston Latin School and Boston College, received his MD from Harvard Medical School, did an internship at Cleveland Metropolitan General, then Boston Children's Hospital, and later received a master's degree in science and diploma in industrial health from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. He entered the CDC as an EIS officer in 1970, worked on the smallpox eradication program, and then at the CDC Environmental Hazards Activity, and then went to NIOSH to be the director of the Division of Surveillance, Hazard Evaluation, and Field Studies. After serving in the Public Health Service at NIOSH, he went to the Icahn School of Medicine in Mount Sinai in 1985 and directed the Division of Environmental and Occupational Medicine, and then was chair of preventive medicine until his retirement for those positions in 2018, coming back to Boston and Boston College. He has had a long and distinguished career and has done some groundbreaking and foundational work in poisoning in children, pesticide exposure in children. He was the principal investigator on the World Trade Center Responders Data and Coordinating Center following responders to the 9/11 attacks, and serves on multiple committees, including committees of the National Academy of Medicine, as well as in the past on the Presidential Committee on the Gulf War Veterans Illnesses. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American College of Preventive Medicine, the American College of Occupational and Environmental Medicine, the Royal Society of Medicine. I could go on and on. I won't. He's won innumerable awards. I just will mention the Herbert Needleman Medal and Award from the American Public Health Association and the Broad Street Pump Award in Environmental Health from the Physicians for Social Responsibility, as well as the Irving Selikoff Award from the Collegium Ramazzini in Occupational Health. So without further ado, Dr. Landrigan on climate change, pollution, and health, what healthcare professionals can do.
Thank you, Dr. DiMaria. I will activate my screen here and get on with it. Okay. Just a minute, please. Okay, is that showing okay now?
Looks good.
Very good, thanks. So as Dr. DiMaria said, my title this evening is Climate Change, Pollution and Health. What can healthcare professionals do? I'd like to begin by amplifying what Dr. Peters said about Dr. Garland. He was clearly a grand man, pediatrician of great renown, served as editor of the New England Journal of Medicine from 47 to 67, 20-year span, trustee of the Boston Medical Library, or president of the Boston Medical Library after that for 3 years. He was instrumental in his 20-year span as editor for elevating the New England Journal of Medicine from a prestigious but rather local publication to a journal that has worldwide recognition. That's a quote from Franz Ingelfinger, who succeeded Dr. Garland as editor of the journal. And he was ahead of his time in his views that were quite progressive. He was a button-down New Englander. He didn't get up on the barricades and scream, but he was very dedicated to moving the needle on socioeconomic issues, encouraging articles on such topics as the intersection between poverty and health, and advocating for something that was very controversial in his time, which was the need for Medicaid. A great quote from one of the notices of his death was that he believed that physicians should be conservatively progressive, but not progressively conservative. And I'll try to abide by that maxim this evening. I also want to thank the Garland family for their support of this lecture, and especially Allison Carlson, a personal friend who is the stepdaughter of the late Joseph E. Garland of Gloucester, who was the son of Dr. Joseph Garland. And Ms. Carlson told me over the weekend that she would be with us this evening in honor of her dear stepfather, who so cherished his own father's legacy. So let's talk about climate change and pollution. And the central point I want to make in this talk is that these are not merely environmental problems. They're health problems. They affect people. They're causing disease and premature death today. I think that all of us in the medical profession have been slow to come to this realization. Climate change was, for a long time, I would say for perhaps 2 decades, the exclusive province of the climate scientists, the meteorologists, and we watched from a distance. We took a certain level of interest in it. I suspect But it's only really in the last 5 years, I think, that it's come to dawn on us with such things as hurricanes and wildfires, that climate change is with us now. It's not just far away. It's not just in the future. It's causing disease and death today. So definition of climate change is warming of the Earth's surface caused by the buildup of greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere, which act as a blanket around the Earth and trap heat in the atmosphere. And the problem with these greenhouse gases, such as CO2, is that once they get into the atmosphere, they have a long half-life. CO2 hangs around for 80 or 100 years, which means that even if we were to stop all emissions today, unlikely, the temperature would still continue to rise for some number of years because there's a certain amount of momentum built into the system. Can't just shut it off. Here's a graph. You've probably seen versions of this looking at atmospheric levels of CO2 over the past 800,000 years, and this obvious spike in the last 150 years here. Here's a close-up of those last 150 years looking now at not at CO2, but at temperature. And you can see that although there's seasonal and annual fluctuations, that the trend for the last 150 years since about 1880 has been inexorably upward. And there are 4 different databases here listed in the various colors, and they're all basically congruent in their findings. Pollution, defined as material released into the environment by human activity, so not volcanic ash, for example, but human waste material that harms the health of people on the planet. And I think it's important to point out that climate change and pollution are very closely connected. They both arise in the most part from fossil fuels. Combustion of fossil fuels is the main source of the greenhouse gases. It's also the main source of air pollution by particulates and oxides of nitrogen and sulfur. Fossil fuels are also the feedstocks for most chemical and plastic production, and so fossil carbon is ultimately responsible for chemical pollution. And the good news here, and I'll come back to the good news at the end of the talk, is that when we control any one of these problems, we control one or more of the others, and we can reap a double or even a triple benefit. So the health consequences of climate change, just to run through it rather quickly. First and most obvious, hotter temperatures, more heat waves. The little chart here, the graphic, looks at 2 scenarios. In the yellow buff color is a scenario where CO2 emissions are reduced and the temperature rises are not so striking. By contrast, the red bar indicates what's projected to happen to the end of the century if there are no reductions in CO2 emissions. And at that point in time, it indicates that there would be something like 65 days per year when the temperature would be over 90 degrees, which is clearly much more than we've been used to historically in Boston. More severe and frequent storms are another consequence. Here's a graph that was in the New York Times not long ago, showing the gradually increasing frequency of Category 4 and 5 hurricanes over the past 42 years since 1980. And here's some hurricane pictures, huge devastation, lots of death and disease, people hit by falling objects, people electrocuted, people get dysentery from drinking contaminated water, people that need medications and treatment, for example, diabetics, people on cancer chemotherapy can't get their treatments because of the hurricane, many health problems just a couple of months ago. Wildfires in California, people out there have been carefully studying the respiratory effects of wildfire smoke. And although wildfire smoke is not a pollutant, as I define it as a human produced contaminant, nonetheless, wildfire smoke contains pretty much the same mix of toxic materials that classic air pollution contains: particulates, sulfur oxides, nitrogen oxides, and clearly has negative effects on the respiratory system, the cardiovascular system. the drought, which leads to crop failure. As the world gets warmer, vector-borne diseases like malaria, dengue, Zika will have an expanded geographic range and a longer season. This is a projected map here for malaria, and you can see the map projects increasing malaria up the east coast of Mexico and across the Gulf Coast of the USA into Florida. This is really revisiting history. Some of you will know that the reason CDC is in Atlanta, it was placed there during World War II, when military recruits from the Northeast were coming down to Georgia, South Carolina for military training and falling sick from malaria, which of course they'd never previously encountered. And CDC's first mission was to eradicate malaria in the Southeast during those years. And now it looks like with the resurgence of the anopheles, it could come back. One of the consequences of drought is food insecurity and famine. That leads in turn to refugees, people being displaced, wars, conflicts. And it's always the vulnerable, the poor, minorities, infants, the elderly, who suffer the worst. So let's turn to pollution and talk about its health consequences. And the data I'll show here come from the Lancet Commission on Pollution and Health, which we published in 2018 and updated earlier this year. And the main finding in both of those analyses, it really hadn't changed that much, is that pollution kills about 9 million people around the world each year. That's 3 times more than AIDS, TB, and malaria put together. Here's a graph showing the contribution of pollution over there to the right, and you can see that the only other cause of death that rivals pollution is tobacco. It's way ahead of malnutrition, drug abuse, alcohol, road injuries, and so on. The biggest pollution, of course, has various forms. There's air pollution, there's water pollution, soil pollution, chemical pollution. Air pollution is by far the biggest of these, the one that's responsible for the most deaths, 7 million deaths per year, of which about 4.5 or 5 million are due to ambient air pollution, and the balance due to household air pollution, mostly in poor developing countries. Household air pollution, deaths from household air pollution are going down because the World Health Organization and lots of NGOs are working very hard in India and Africa and Latin America to bring clean cook stoves into villages, even bring in little portable stoves that run on solar power. But on the left side here, ambient air pollution is getting worse around the world, with China and India leading the way, Africa coming up behind. And if current trends continue unabated, the number of deaths from ambient air pollution could go up around 9 or 10 million by 2050. So here are some of the health effects of air pollution, and these health effects have been learned over the years from big multi-year epidemiologic follow-up studies like the Harvard 6-city study. In adults, we now know that air pollution causes heart disease, stroke, chronic lung disease, hypertension, diabetes, dementia, and I left off lung cancer. In children, low birth weight, prematurity, stillbirth, asthma, and most recently, there's evidence from multiple studies that prenatal and early childhood exposure to particulate air pollution reduces children's IQ, reduces their intelligence. This is a slide from the New England Journal from an article we published last year on the pathophysiology of how pollution exposure causes heart disease. And basically, it begins with oxidative stress. Particles get in, the very small particles, the PM2.5, are small enough that they can go deep into the lungs, and some of them can get through the alveolar membrane and actually get into the circulating bloodstream. And they start hitting the endothelial lining and other cells around the body. They cause oxidative stress. That in turn causes autonomic dysfunction, can scuff up the endothelial lining, can trigger diabetes. And the end result, sometimes after many years, is cardiac disease, acute myocardial infarction, stroke, heart failure, and the major arrhythmias. So what's the current status of air pollution in this country? Well, basically, we've done a pretty good job, not a perfect job, but a fairly good job in this country in passing the Clean Air, since we passed the Clean Air Act, which was signed by President Nixon in 1970. And the Clean Air Act gave EPA the power to limit pollution from stationary sources like power plants and mobile sources like motor vehicles, set standards, enforcement, penalties, and it remains the major air pollution law in the United States today. The last year, a couple of years ago, I should say, the EPA proposed to expand the scope of the Clean Air Act to also regulate greenhouse gas emissions. As some of you will know, that action was nullified by the Supreme Court, but the other provisions of the Clean Air Act remain in force. Just to give you a sense of how effective the Clean Air Act has been, let me show you what has happened to air pollution in Cleveland, Ohio. I picked Cleveland because, as Dr. DeMaria said, I interned out there in 67, 68. This picture here was taken in Cleveland in 1968, about 4 blocks from my hospital, Cleveland Metropolitan General Hospital. I didn't take the picture, but I can assure you that's what the air was like in those days in Cleveland. I can remember some mornings when we went into the hospital, there was so much smoke in the interior corridors in the hospital. So much had infiltrated in through the windows and so on, that you couldn't see down the length of the corridor. It was striking. And here's Cleveland today. It's quite amazing. Turn around. That's the Cuyahoga River, which in 1969, the year after I left Cleveland, caught fire because it was so heavily polluted with petroleum waste. Another big gain that was brought about by the Clean Air Act was that it essentially eliminated airborne lead pollution in this country by requiring the removal of lead from gasoline. However, progress is not automatic, and in the last 4 years, progress against air pollution stalled and in fact went backwards a bit. For the first time in almost 50 years, we saw increased pollution-related deaths, and ironically, the increases were most severe in the states that voted for the previous president. Places like New England, California, we were largely buffeted against the worst impacts of those rollbacks because we have strong state level protections. But that experience caused colleagues and myself to ask what is in fact going on with air pollution in Massachusetts today. And so we did a study supported by the Barr Foundation of Boston, looking at the health effects of air pollution in the Commonwealth, in every city and town. The study was inspired by Tip O'Neill's maxim that all politics are local, and we reckon that since public health in Massachusetts is a very local function, operates basically at the city and town level, that it would make sense to look at the impacts of air pollution at that same geographic level. So the goal was to quantify the impact of PM 2.5 pollution on disease and death in each city and town in Massachusetts, to look also at air pollution and IQ loss, and lastly, to create a model that people elsewhere across the United States might use if they wanted to do a similar analysis in their states. So we began by looking at the sources of air pollution in Massachusetts, and it turns out that each in 2017, which was the most recent year from which we could get data out of EPA, 938,000 tons of air pollution were emitted in Massachusetts, about 2/3 of it from mobile sources, 1/3 from stationary, which includes factories, electricity plants, home heating and cooking. And the other big finding is that fossil fuel combustion is responsible for about 95% of our air pollution here. A little bit, especially in the more rural parts of the state, comes from burning wood in fireplaces, wood boilers and such, but across the state, 95% of it is fossil fuel combustion. We looked at PM 2.5 concentrations by county, and we used publicly available data from Mass DEP to do this calculation. And what we found was that the average concentration of fine particulate pollution, PM 2.5 pollution, was 6.3 micrograms in 2019. The low was in Worcester County, and I know a few folks from Worcester County are on here, so you should feel proud that in the county, maybe not in Worcester City, you've got some of the best air in the state. The worst is here in Boston, in Suffolk County. But all of these concentrations are legal. They're all below the EPA standard of 12 micrograms. So we're well within legal guidelines. I note, however, that just last year in 2021, the World Health Organization cranked down their guideline from 10 micrograms to 5 micrograms. And they did that because there's an emerging body of evidence that air pollution can cause disease and death at levels below 10 or 12 micrograms. So I suspect that sometime in the next couple of years, EPA will want to reduce their guideline. But right now, it's still 12 and we're still within 12. Despite that, despite the fact that we're legal, our best estimate is that in 2019, air pollution was responsible for nearly 3,000 premature deaths among adults in Massachusetts, heart disease, stroke, lung cancer, lung disease, and in kids for 303 low birth weights, about 15,000 cases of asthma, and the loss of nearly 2 million IQ points. All of these effects were clearly most severe in low-income minority communities, no real surprise because we know where roads and factories tend to be located. But we also were very explicit in making the point here that no city or town in Massachusetts is immune. Even the wealthiest suburbs around Boston have their share of disease and death, IQ loss in children due to air pollution. It's really everybody's problem. Some people have it worse than others, but everybody suffers. And here's a little map we put together looking at all-cause mortality attributable to PM 2.5 pollution in every city and town across the Commonwealth. And for those of you who want to look at these data in more detail, we had a young man, Luke Bryan, who graduated from Boston College out of cycle last December. Luke was a math major and a public health minor, and he put his skills to work last spring and built us a website. The most interesting feature of this website is an interactive map. You can click on your town and you can immediately, up will come the information showing how many air pollution related deaths occurred in your town in 2019. It does it by cause, heart disease, stroke, and it also provides the information on how many IQ points were lost in children. Another feature of the map is that it has what we call a compare function. You can compare your town with somebody else's town and see how they stack up against each other. So that's all the bad news, but I want to, in the last few minutes of my presentation here, I want to give you some good news. And the most important piece of good news is that climate change can be mitigated and pollution can be prevented. And the best evidence of that is the simple fact that countries like our own have already taken major steps to reduce pollution. As I've already mentioned, we've reduced our air pollution by more than 70%. We're beginning to reduce our CO2 emissions. We really know how to do it. The impediment is no longer technical. The impediment is political, economic, and the influence of vested interests, especially the fossil fuel industry, who really don't want the current situation to change. And in order to get past that, we're going to have to pass laws and regulations. We're going to have to do monitoring and enforcement. And we're going to have to offer incentives, as the new federal legislation does, offering major incentives for installing solar panels, buying electric cars, and taking other actions that will reduce both air pollution and climate change, and therefore give us a double win. We've all heard the line that pollution control is very expensive, that it costs jobs, that it will kill the economy. I'd like to show you some data that argue that that's simply not true. So this graph is taken with permission from the New England Journal, a paper that came out in 2016. And what it's looking at here it's firstly looking at air pollution. So this is air pollution in the United States since 1970, this downward trending line here. That is the 74% reduction in air pollution emissions that we've achieved in this country. And I'll leave out the lines in the middle, but direct your attention to this green line that goes up here at the top. That's the GDP, the measure of the national economy. And it turns out that in these 50 years, the GDP increased by 250%, even as air pollution was falling by 70%. So I just think this puts the lie to the claim that pollution control kills the economy. It actually benefits the economy because it keeps people healthier. It reduces healthcare costs, keeps people out of the hospital, and because they have healthier, longer lives, they're able to stay at work more, they're able to be more productive at work, and we have fewer productivity losses. And we had economists with whom we worked to actually run the numbers on this, and they're very robust. So here are some recommendations that we offered in that study on air pollution in Massachusetts. The overarching recommendation is that the USA and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts need to move as rapidly as possible away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy. And some specific steps to do that are firstly to convert public vehicle fleets to electric. The U.S. Postal Service has already announced that they're going to do this. They're in the market for 200,000 electric postal vehicles. Solar panels on the roof of public buildings, upgrade public transport. We've really got to make the T more efficient, more effective, so that people will take it and not throw up their hands in dismay and get in the car. And maybe construct a high-speed rail line across the state. Cities, towns, hospitals, even individual families have the option in most parts of Massachusetts to preferentially purchase green electricity, and I encourage people and institutions, municipalities to do that. Something else that I hope the new governor will do when she comes in January is block the construction of gas pipelines and compressor stations. I've been involved with some folks in Weymouth and Quincy trying to, for 3 years, to block the construction of the compressor station that was put into North Weymouth by Fore River. Should never have been put there. It's in a heavily populated area. It's on a floodplain. It's really quite unnecessary, but it was rammed through. Several cities and towns, beginning with Brookline, have prohibited gas hookups and new construction. And the new climate bill that Governor Baker signed into law not long ago allows at least 10 municipalities across the Commonwealth to follow Brookline's lead on this. I understand that the city of Boston under Mayor Wu will be among those 10. And we need to revise building codes to improve energy efficiency. A piece of nice news here is that it has become much cheaper, much cheaper to produce electricity from wind and solar power compared to fossil fuels. And this has happened quite rapidly. This graph covers the 10-year span from 2010 to 2020. And you can see back in 2010, solar electricity was much more expensive than fossil electricity, which is this gray band across here. But it's been coming down, down, down all around the world. You can see the different databases here. And now in many places, including much of New England, it's actually cheaper, not just competitive, but cheaper to produce electricity from wind and solar than from any fossil fuel, including gas. And in fact, this has the electric industry so worried that ISO New England, which is the independent systems operator of New England, they're the people that operate the grid for the 6 New England states, have tried to exclude green electricity from the power grid because they're afraid it will put fossil fuel fired power plants out of business, which I say is a good thing, but obviously they have a different point of view. We've heard talk about nuclear energy as a possible solution to the climate crisis. Well, it is true that nuclear fuel does not release CO2 or any other greenhouse gas. That's the good part of the story, but nuclear reactors are very expensive. They wouldn't exist without major subsidies. They're not self-sufficient. They all, no matter how well designed they are, they inevitably generate nuclear waste, which has a tremendously long half-life, and nobody wants it. The Atomic Energy Commission, the Department of Energy, has been trying for 50 years to find a place where they could stash this stuff, and nobody wants it at all. There's the danger that it can be hijacked or spilled during transit. Whenever there's nuclear waste, there's a potential threat to national security because people can steal it. When reactors don't blow up often, of course, the engineers build them as safely as they possibly can with multiple redundancies, but when they do blow up, think Chernobyl, think Fukushima, maybe in the near future in Ukraine, I hope not. But when these reactors do blow up, the health consequences are catastrophic, just absolutely catastrophic. And finally, we just don't need nuclear. As renewables get cheaper and cheaper, there's just no reason to spend millions of dollars on reactors when we can put a solar panel on the roof for 10 or 20 bucks. So let me conclude my last 2 slides, I think, maybe 3, by asking the rhetorical question: how can we, physicians, nurses, public health workers, other professionals, how can we make a difference? I think, first of all, we have to recognize that we remain very highly trusted communicators. Nurses are reported to be the most trusted profession in America. Pediatricians are held in extremely high regard. People trust us, and when we speak with authority, when we know our facts, most people at least, will listen. And that gives us the opportunity to guide our patients to do things to reduce their carbon footprint, to reduce their pollution. And when our patients happen to be elected officials or policymakers, lawmakers, people on Beacon Hill, people in city and town government, we can put the word in their ear. We've been doing that as a profession for decades, probably centuries. We can offer guidance to individual patients, things, for example, like don't go jogging on a day when the air is really nasty out there. Or if you're a chronic COPD patient, you might want to think about getting an indoor air purifier. It doesn't solve the root problem, but it can prevent misery in the patient. And we have the ability to basically persuade lawmakers. Sometimes I think it's important that we venture beyond our clinic, beyond our practice, beyond our office, beyond our lab, and go testify before legislators on Beacon Hill, write op-eds, take other actions. Obviously, stay within the science, always stay within the science, but use the science to persuade people that make decisions in our society that decisions need to be made. And we need to tell the story of how a transition to clean energy will slow the pace of climate change, reduce pollution, and save lives. And I'll conclude by mentioning the shining example of Bernie Lown, who passed away just last year. Most of you will remember that he was a world-renowned cardiologist at the Brigham, Harvard Medical School, invented the defibrillator. 40 years ago, back in 1980, he and Dr. Eric Chivian from Harvard and others in the USA connected with Dr. Chazov, who was a Russian cardiologist and the personal doctor to Brezhnev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union at that time. And they said, basically, the doctors said to each other and then said to their respective leaders, we can't go on the course we're doing. This is mutually insane. It's going to lead to mass suicide. We need to restrict the use of nuclear weapons. And those conversations led a few years later to the passage of the SALT treaties limiting nuclear war. It's obviously not perfect. Think North Korea, for example, but it has certainly prevented nuclear holocaust for the past half century. And it's a model for what we can do as physicians today against climate change. And it's nice to point out that Bernie Lown and his colleagues, Eric Jivian and the rest of them, Chazov, won the 1985 Nobel Peace Prize for their heroic efforts on that front. So with that, I'll say thank you. I'll remind us all that we are the stewards of this earth. We hold it in trust for our children and for our grandchildren. I'll stop now and stop sharing my screen, and I'm open for questions and thanks.
And we have questions in the Q&A box, and people should continue to put them in. First question is, if CO2 and methane is so bad, what would happen if we lowered the production completely? In other words, all of the human-produced, presumably, gases would be gone.
Yeah, so in the hypothetical case where we ended all releases of greenhouse gases tonight, all around the world, what we would see is that for the next 40 or 50 years, temperatures, global mean temperatures would continue to go up. And that's because of the fact that the carbon dioxide and the methane in the atmosphere have a long half-life measured in decades. But over that span of time, the pace of increase would slow down. And finally, about 40 or 50 years from now, it would stop. And then after a while, things would begin to cool down.
Okay, next question from Judd Klein. How does mass data compare with California? We always hear about California regulatory environments, and what's the difference?
Well, we don't have wildfires. That's one big difference. Wildfires have really been the bane of California, Oregon, and Washington the last few years. But that aside, they've done a very good job out there in controlling man-made sources of air pollution. They've got very strict rules and regulations. Governor Newsom passed a very far-reaching climate bill just a month or two ago, which is going to put California on a very rapid track to get off fossil fuels and go towards renewables. I would say they're a little bit ahead of us, but we're to use the track analogy, we're in the lead pack. We, New York, and California are probably the best three in the country, but California is in first place right now.
This question is from Allison Carlson. What are your recommendations about countering oil and gas massive petrochemical infrastructure build out? And in particular, the tripling of plastics by 2050.
All right. So let me back up a bit and give a little context here. So what's happening is that the fossil fuel industry, and particularly the gas industry, is working very hard and very fast to build out the pipeline network and to build out various key facilities like compressor stations. And they do this because they recognize that the market for gas as a fuel is softening, but they reckon, I believe, that if they can get those pipes out there and get the gas into people's homes, then people will be locked into gas for the next 30, 40, 50 years, and that will preserve their market. So that's one dimension of what they're doing. And I think the best way to counter that is partly at the federal level to stop the construction of major pipelines like one that they want to bring down from Canada through Sault Ste. Marie in Michigan, but also for states and localities to do things such follow the lead of Brookline here in Massachusetts and block gas hookups in homes. Now, the other thing that Allison is alluding to, it goes a bit beyond what I was covering on the talk, but let me take just a moment and speak to it. The oil and gas industry are currently pivoting away from selling fossil carbon as a fuel to burn, and they're pivoting to putting that fossil carbon from coal and oil and gas into the manufacture of plastic. Fossil carbon is the feedstock for 98% of plastic. And the problem that the fossil fuel industry has right now has two components. Firstly, the market for burning fossil carbon is slowly diminishing, not as fast as I'd like, but it's diminishing. And at the same time, they're sitting on enormous reserves of oil and gas that they build up through fracking. And they want to sell this stuff. They're a business, they want to make a profit. And so they're rapidly expanding the build out of the infrastructure to convert natural gas and oil into plastic. And the centerpiece of these networks are plants which go by the name of cracker plants. They're catalytic cracking plants, which convert the ethane and the methane that are the main components of gas into ethylene, which is a main building block for plastic. And there's a huge one just going into the ground now outside Pittsburgh, cost about $6 billion, I believe I read. And it's just like locking people into natural gas. If the plastics industry can get this steel and concrete into the ground, they'll be able to persuade the federal government that they're too big to be shut down. And so I think it becomes very important that policymakers keep a sharp eye on this and realize that we really don't need a 40% increase in plastic, especially when most of it is disposable, one-use plastic, like the wrapper that you tear off your dry cleaning, for example.
Both Colin Phillips and Regina LaRocque ask about the healthcare sector and what do you see as how we can approach the healthcare sector as healthcare providers and our own contributions to the pollution.
Yeah, well, the healthcare sector is a major producer of greenhouse gases, and we, as an industrial sector, if I may use that word, have lagged well behind private businesses. Most big Fortune 500 companies now have a carbon reduction plan. They don't always follow it, but at least they have a plan, and they have strategies. And the better companies are in fact beginning to reduce their carbon emissions. Most hospitals, most healthcare systems haven't even really done an inventory to know how much they produce. And I think the healthcare sector is going to have to come along. We can do a lot more than we're doing.
Question from Frederick Myers about what's the mechanism for air pollution lowering intelligence?
Oh, that's fascinating. So it all has to do with the fine particulate pollution, the PM 2.5. And if a pregnant woman inhales these particles in polluted air, they'll go down into her lungs. Some will get through into her bloodstream, cross the alveolar membrane, and then pass into the brain of the developing fetus. And in the infant brain, they can cause the same kinds of damage that they cause in the endothelial lining of the blood vessels in adult. They cause oxidative stress. They can cause cellular damage. And presumably, nobody's done the pathology yet, but presumably neuronal loss, which is what other developmental neurotoxicants do, which plays out as decreased IQ, shortened attention span. And there's about 5 or 6 good studies now from around the world that show quite consistently negative correlations, or inverse correlations, I should say, between rising levels of PM 2.5 pollution during pregnancy, during early infancy, and decreasing IQ scores in children.
From Western Massachusetts, T. Stephen Jones asks, if hydrogen is much invoked to replace methane as natural gas pipelines, seems like a scam. Could you comment, please?
Hello, Steve Jones. We used to serve at CDC together, and it probably is a scam. The hydrogen, of course, on the face of it, seems like the perfect fuel, right? When you burn it, what does it produce? It produces H2O. What could be better? But in the real world, it has problems. Most of the hydrogen that the fossil fuel industry would like to introduce into gas pipelines will be produced by a process called coal gasification, which is enormously energy intensive, releases large volumes of greenhouse gas. It's hardly a green technology. Secondly, that hydrogen is much more explosive than regular natural gas, which is mainly methane and ethane. And if something bad were to happen, such as happened up in Andover and Lowell in 2018, and there's a leak and a spark, the fire and explosion is going to be substantially worse than if it were just gas alone. And a third drawback is that if a mixture of natural gas and hydrogen is actually pumped into people's homes, which is what some of the producers are talking about doing, the appliances that we have in our homes, our furnaces, our hot water heaters, our stoves, are not equipped to deal with this mix, and we'd have to replace them at considerable expense to ratepayers. So I think it's really it's a non-starter, but the industry is worried about the future. They're looking for strategies to advance their cause, and this is one of the strategies that they've developed.
Ilana Schmidt asks, to what extent has progress in the U.S. since 1970 come at the expense of developing countries, where we shifted manufacturing? And
yeah, some of it does. I mean, there's no question that some of it is at the expense of developing countries, but not all of it by any means. Our cars emit many fewer pounds of pollutants per vehicle mile today than the old clunkers of the 1970s and 80s. Our factories run cleaner than they used to do. But to be sure, the offshoring of the steel and chemical industries means that some of the pollution that we used to produce here is now being produced in China, Indonesia, sub-Saharan Africa.
Question from Luann Thorndike. Do you have any data and graphs showing the decrease in particular air pollution in the early COVID pandemic? I think the point is that did the potential reduction in pollution affect health in a positive way?
Yeah, it did, in fact. There was some air pollution data from France and England said that air pollution levels went down about 40 or 50% in the first half of 2020 when COVID first hit. In the USA, it was about a 25% decline. There were some beautiful satellite pictures taken over China and India showing enormous reductions in pollution. Of course, it's mostly come back now. The other thing that we should all be aware of about COVID and air pollution is that some very good data from the Harvard School of Public Health, Francesca Dominici and her group, showed quite clearly that zip codes in the USA with higher levels of pollution had higher death rates from COVID, even when all the other social and economic factors that you might think of were held constant in the equation.
Sue Hollingsworth notes that population just reached 8 billion in the world, and should population control, to the extent possible, be part of the overall solution?
Yeah. Has to be. The good news is that the rate of increase has been slowing since the 1960s, but there's so much momentum built into the system that we won't see an actual downturn in the global numbers of people for another 50 or 75 years.
We're coming close to the end, so I think this is appropriate. There's many questions here. Unfortunately, we don't have time for all of them, but how do we deal with one of the greatest problems, which is a political one, the denial of global warming?
Well, it's like we all deal with this, right, in our practice every day. We run into people that don't want to believe things. And I think the best we can do is be patient, be persistent, listen to people, don't try to ram information down their throats, find out what's on their minds. A lot of times you can, not always, of course, but a lot of people, if they're rational human beings, you can engage them in conversation and persuade them to rethink their position. But it's, it's like P.T. Barnum said a long time ago, that you can fool some of the people all the time and all the people some of the time. but you can't fool all the people all the time. And I think it's medical education or education of patients has some of the same elements.
And let me just add one last comment from Dr. John Pastore, who says your presentation should be grand rounds at all our medical centers.
Tell Dr. Pastore I'd be glad to do that as long as I can do it on Zoom and don't have to travel to every hospital across the Commonwealth.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Landrigan and Dr. DeMaria, and thank you all for attending. I'd like to encourage you all to go to bml.org, and if you are a physician or a dentist, please consider becoming a fellow of the Boston Medical Library, which is a great institution that needs to rebuild its fellowship and provide service to the practicing physicians and dentists in Massachusetts again. Thank you, Dr. Landrigan.
Thank you, Dr. Peters. Thank you, Dr. DeMaria, and to all in the audience.
Good night, all.
Good night.